You have to know your audience, they say. But how do you do that? If you spend any time around people of a rhetorical persuasion, or if you spent any time watching this show,
then you probably have a lot of regret.
Hey, no interrupting. What I was going to say, though, is that you've probably heard the advice delivered as law that you should know your audience whenever you write something. And it is good advice. Whether you're trying to persuade, entertain, teach, or something else, it's really useful to know who you're dealing with, what they care about, what they're looking for, and what would or wouldn't work for them. At its most simple, your writing probably will fail if it doesn't connect with an audience. But if you're like most writers, the work you do happens when you're alone at a desk. Your audience isn't there. You don't even know for sure that there's going to be an audience out there at all. I mean, we all hope to find an audience, but how do you write for an audience that you can't observe? It's relatively easier to adapt your work to an audience when they're right there in front of you. When I'm teaching a class, for example, it's easy to see when students are engaged and when they aren't, and then to adjust accordingly. But a writer has no such luxury, and Walter Ong made that same observation in a now famous article when he said that when we're writing, no one is listening. There is no feedback. So in some ways, telling a writer to know their audience and adapt their writing to the needs of that audience might feel a little unfair. What do you do when you can't observe your audience and respond accordingly? Well, Ong's solution is to make your readers up. Just fictionalize them. In Ong's words, the writer's audience is always a fiction. So the writer must construct an audience cast in some sort of role, which is a process that requires you first to imagine your prototypical reader. Who do you imagine reading your work in the first place? And then, as you start to imagine that reader, imagine casting them in a role that they can play while they read your work. Does your writing ask them to be a fellow traveler on an epic journey to save the kingdom? Does it position them as an invited guest into your memories? Does it put your reader in the role of your political enemy or your potential ally? You may not know who your audience is literally, but creating a fictional profile of your reader can help you to write with a more productive sense of purpose. You're not likely to write your fantasy novel in the same way if you're aiming for middle schoolers versus middle-agers, and on top of that, you won't write the same middle-grade fantasy if you cast your readers in the role of tolerated observers versus honored guests at the grand feast. For some kinds of writing, imagining an audience and writing for them is a more straightforward process. I mean, it is generally easier to build a profile for suburban parents when you're writing an argument about the value of youth sports programs. But for others, a clear focus on audience gets trickier, and in some circles, audience might go completely ignored. And that's why early in a class, I like to give poetry students some time to reflect on who their readers might be, how they spend their time, where they read, why they choose to read poems in the first place, and what makes them happy or sad. When you consider things like that, you can begin to write with more focus. If you're aiming for an audience of scholars and critics, you're going to write different poems from what you would write if you were aiming for an audience of real people who read poetry after a day of work or over their breakfast. Of course, on the flip side of all this, when you create a fictionalized version of your audience, your actual flesh and blood audience, as Ong says, must correspondingly fictionalize itself. A reader has to play the role which the author has cast him, which seldom coincides with his role in the rest of his actual life. And that makes sense. People have complex identities and roles to play in life, and they have to take off one hat in order to wear whatever hat you're giving them when they spend time with your work. So you could write a persuasive argument and address your readers as brain-dead nincompoops who need a stern talking to, or you could address them as collaborators as you work together to find a way to achieve your shared goals. But if you do choose the former, don't be surprised if you have a smaller audience. Because, and this could probably go without saying, your audience doesn't have to accept the role you've placed them in. If they don't want to identify with your fictionalized vision of them, they won't keep reading. And that's not to say that you need to have a broad, generic vision of your audience either. Something written for everyone is really written for no one. Instead, what I mean is that once you have an idea of who your intended reader is, just make sure you're giving them a role that they'll find agreeable. You're completely allowed not to appeal to readers that you're not interested in, but you should probably avoid alienating the people you actually want to reach, you know?
Do as he says, not as he does.
Well, what's that supposed to mean?
I'm physically incapable of sleep, and you're making me drowsy.
Oh, well, maybe you're just not the target audience, bud.
And yet, here I sit, week after week.
Oh, you know you love it. But anyway, the good news is that writers are not forever forced to just suppose who their readers might be. Once you start putting your work out there in any capacity, you'll start to know your readers with a little more certainty. For example, the archetype of my intended poetry reader is informed by years of friends and teachers giving me feedback on my writing. When I sit down to write, I still occasionally hear the voices of past readers informing how I approach future readers. Now, that reader is still a fiction, but it's a fiction informed by real experiences with actual readers. And even this show, in the early days, I had a vague sense of who I was making videos for, and I shared a video with an old professor. And his feedback was that he wasn't sure who my audience was, which, to be fair, I'm not totally sure he understood what my vision for the channel was, but either way, I got to spend a good chunk of that early period reconciling my now newly induced who's my audience identity crisis with the fact that my goals and his feedback probably weren't in perfect alignment. But as this audience has grown, I've been able to gain a clearer sense of who I'm actually making videos for and how those videos should work. Now, when I sit down to script, shoot, or edit, my intended viewer is still a fiction. It's not any one real person, but now it's informed by years of comments and analytics data. Where my fictionalized audience started out as a shadowy silhouette of a viewer, it has become a more robust amalgamation of all that I've learned from all of you. Which is really to say, as is almost always the case, that the best thing you can do is to start writing and then learn as you go. Share your work, observe your readers' responses, and use that information to shape how you write the next thing. There can be a lot of pressure to write the thing that will serve as your writerly legacy, but that's only because we usually never see the writing that never got published or the drafts that didn't make it past the peer review. So your success as a writer will also probably not be in a single brilliant flash of inspiration, but will much more likely be in the iterative accumulation of knowledge and skills that come with practice, observation, and getting to know your audience over time. The better you get at creating worthwhile roles for your hypothetical reader, the more your readers will enjoy your work and let you know, which will in turn make you better at writing the things that serve your readers well, and that mutually reinforcing cycle, not the whims of the muse, is where you'll really make your mark. So start writing for an imaginary audience so you can start learning about your real audience. If you're interested in learning more about building your audience, be sure to check out the video that'll pop up in the end screen. But either way, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.